Hi, thanks for tuning in. This is the US Futures Weekly Chart Analysis for the week ending 9th of January 2026. The first chart is the US Dollar Index Futures, which closed higher this week. Did a pretty good job, really. Spread increased, volume increased, almost to the average. Volumes are normally not back to their normal levels just yet, and probably will increase to normal levels next week. Price found some support at this minor level over the last 3 weeks. Did look a little bit vulnerable on this down bar here, and even last week's holiday affected up bar did look a little weak, but price has gathered itself up and pushed higher and into the next minor level above. I do note that there's been some supply drawn out whenever price has moved above this level. So I would expect the market will spend a little bit of time in here consolidating, probably testing for supply early next week. And then depending on how much supply is drawn out, if there is continuing supply drawn out, I expect price to attempt to consolidate in here within this week's bars range. And if supply is light next week, then there may be an attempt to push up to the highs of the range. I don't expect a price breakout at this point in time. The higher prices this week did put some of the currencies under pressure, but I do note that some of the metals did push higher despite the increase in the US dollar index futures, which is generally a positive for those markets. This is E-mini S&P 500 index futures. They just popped up a little higher this week. It wasn't a significant push higher. Price moved higher, finding some support at this breakout line. Volume did increase but remained below the average, so still holiday affected. That should normalise next week. It was a minor push higher. It really wasn't significant. It did close just slightly above the previous up bar, which was a positive. Prices effectively floated higher this week on a lack of selling pressure. US Treasury 10-year note futures. They're seeing some defence at the previous support level. Here's the previous support level here, where support came in back here. We've had some consolidation sideways overall. This market probably could have broken down this week in response to the previous bar, but although it doesn't look particularly strong, the market is defending against supply at this level. I'm not sure it'll be successful overall, but there's certainly an attempt to do so. Volume increased to slightly above the average, so there certainly was increased activity in this market this week. And it does look a little vulnerable, but there is an attempt to support the market. Copper price futures. Copper price futures pushed up and tagged the highs of the range this week. That was probably showing you some intent up here. Supply was drawn out, there's no doubt, up here, which isn't surprising. This is a pretty serious level up here. Price closed adjacent to the previous up bar's high, and volume increased to well above the average despite it being a holiday week. There was some significant trading this week in this market. Supply was drawn out, but price pushed up and tagged the highs of the range, the major highs, and it was probably showing you some intent. This is where it wants to go. So I would expect in response you'll see a narrow spread test for supply early in the week, and if supply is found to be low, I expect an attempt to push higher this week, later in the week, and probably up to these highs of the range. I don't necessarily expect a breakout, because I do expect there'll be a little bit of effort required up there. You may see price just pop just slightly out the top, but it'll depend on how much supply is drawn out when price tests for supply early. If there is supply drawn out, then it's more than likely going to see some consolidation in here first prior to any serious attempt to push higher. But this was a significant move this week, and it was probably showing you the underlying intent of the market, which is to push higher. Gold price futures pushed higher this week as well. And this is significant in itself, similar to the copper price futures, where prices moved higher despite the increase in the US dollar. And those markets would generally find themselves under pressure under those circumstances, but they still closed higher in response. That shows these markets really are strong. This market moved higher within the range of the previous down bar on increased volume, but it was still holiday affected volume and slightly below the average. This was an absorption bar. This was the market absorbing supply within the range of the previous down bar, and if that's successful, there'll be an attempt to push higher in response. The highs of the range come through there, and it won't surprise me to see those levels challenged next week. There may not be a significant breakout, but it does appear this market is showing underlying strength, absorbing supply within the previous down bar's range, and it will push up to some degree in response next week, possibly following a test for supply, a narrow and brief test for supply, and then an attempt to push higher if supply is found to be low, and possibly even a more significant push higher. We've done a little bit of work at this level now, and that should open the door for a push higher if trading conditions are favourable. Silver price futures pushed higher this week as well. Another significant move. Price closed pretty much adjacent to the previous up bar high here. This market traded inside the range of the previous down bar all week in absorption mode. Volume was once again very high and significantly high for this time of year. This is really high activity. I expect the market was absorbing supply this week, and there may be a test for supply early in the week, very soon after open, after the weekend. And once that occurs, and if supply is found to be low, I expect this market will attempt to push higher and effectively break out. It'll take some effort to do so, but there's no shortage of effort by the looks of the volume over the last couple of weeks. So if there is only moderate supply in this market, moderate selling pressure, I expect this market will make an attempt to push higher and effectively break out in response. If, however, supply is found to be high, there'll be further consolidation within this week's range in sort of that level. But I do expect supply will be found to be low, or else demand will overwhelm it, and that'll see price attempt to move higher in response, at least to some degree. Like crude price futures, closed higher this week and recovered some of the lost ground. We did see some buying support emerge a month ago down here, and then the 2 weeks in between were really holiday affected, very low volumes, and they looked a little weaker than stronger at the time. You can see the market did test for supply this week below the previous bar's close, and then it pushed higher on an increase in volume and above average volume. There was no holiday effect here. This was strong activity. You've got the overhead resistance up there, so there is a little bit of room to move. So you may see a secondary test for supply within the range of this week's bar next week. And if supply is found to be low, an attempt to move higher in response and probably up to the highs of this range. That's the breakdown line in the background. Or if supply is found to be drawn out, you'll find some consolidation in here. Into the currencies now, and the euro-US dollar currency pair did pull back this week, pulled back from this level in here where price could have held on and down to the next level below, effectively, just slightly off it. I would expect that level below to be tested for strength next week to some degree. I do note that volume, while it did increase, remained below the average, so price really just drifted lower. It wasn't really actively sold into. But I do expect that this level, the next level lower, will be tested for strength next week, at least to some degree. A British pound currency futures, and they closed lower this week. They're acting a little stronger than the euro. They have done for a little while now. Price moved down from this level, and it didn't really reach the level below. It's trying to hold on at the lows of that previous up bar, and that's a little stronger than the euro. Volume in this market was also increased, but below the average, so it wasn't actively sold into. This was the market just drifting lower, mostly on the strength in the US dollar and not really active selling in this market. Japanese yen currency futures, they closed lower this week again and are threatening to break down. This isn't actually a breakdown just yet, but the market is threatening to break down, as it has done so a number of times previously or recently. We did note that the two bars over the last 2 weeks, which were holiday affected trading, were pretty weak bars despite the low volume. So it doesn't surprise me to see the market threatening to break down this week in response to the strength in the US dollar. Aussie dollar currency futures. Aussie dollar currency futures did close lower this week in response to the US dollar strength, but really the market has closed comfortably within the previous up bars range, and it hasn't broken below that breakout line. There's relative strength in this market. Volume increased, and it was slightly above the average, which is good, strong volume at this time of year, and the market held on remarkably well. So this market is showing an underlying strength at this point in time, and any weakness in the US dollar or even sideways movement in the US dollar will likely see this market attempt to move higher. There was a reluctance to move lower this week despite the strength in the US dollar, and there's certainly some levels of potential support below should the US dollar continue showing strength. So this market is certainly showing resilience against the US dollar's strength, at least at this point in time. Bitcoin futures. Bitcoin futures continue to trade in consolidation mode, as expected, consolidating within this range here. We've expected that for some time now. Price did make an attempt to move higher this week, which was thwarted in the end, and price drifted lower. I expect there'll be a test for supply in response next week, at least to some degree. It'll end up looking like this, at least early in the week. And if supply is found to be drawn out, you'll see some further consolidation down here. And if there is little or light supply drawn out, perhaps an attempt later in the week to push up to the highs in this range. The market, however, is doing exactly as it should do. It's defending against supply and making a further breakdown less likely, and it's attempting to build up some strength by absorbing supply sideways in consolidation mode. That's all you can ask for at this point in time. Supply does appear to have dropped off to some degree, but this period of consolidation does not yet appear complete. Just back to the US dollar index futures quickly before we wrap up. Price did close higher this week. It did close a little off its high, so there was a little supply drawn out. You can see that here. I expect there'll be a test for supply early. It'll have a narrower spread, If there is supply drawn out, you'll see some ongoing consolidation in this sort of area. And if supply is found to be low, then you may find the market pushes up to this level. I do note, however, that the market has drawn out some supply when it's moved into this level more recently over here. So a push up to this level here is more likely, and perhaps not much of a challenge to that level, at least in the near term. Okay, thanks for your time. Back again next week. Thanks again. See ya.